theology that led to those justice stances, how Unitarians understood all people to be children of the same God and as such brothers and sisters, and how could we do anything other than support, respect, love, and make life as wonderful as possible for our brothers and sisters, whoever they may be. How Universalists understood God to be all-loving, and understood God to desire that each of us should know heaven. And how could we, in our love for God, not want to recreate that heaven right here, right now? I talk often about how with this ancestry, it's no wonder we focus on justice. We strive for the ideal of a world that is full of possibility and opportunity and respect. We talk about justice and we know where it comes from in our history and our historical theology, but what does it mean to us now, today? How do we confront our knowledge that so many of our fellow humans are suffering in a hell on this earth, trapped in cycles of poverty, suffering as food insecure, suffering with homelessness, suffering with a lack of medical care? How do we confront that it's not a condition of folks like out there in another country anymore, but that it's right here in our own backyards? I've been thinking about Jesus a lot, what with Easter coming, and as Unitarian Universalists, I don't think about Jesus all the time, but with Easter coming, I have been thinking about him. Today is actually Palm Sunday, the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, greeted by people who were laying palm fronds down in his path so he could start his ministry in Jerusalem. And of course, it was a ministry that eventually led to his death, but it was a ministry that was so radical and amazing and just called for a change in the way that things were being done. Jesus, in his ministry, glorified those who'd been cast out, lepers, prostitutes, those who were physically different, parts of ethnic minorities. While the Sermon on the Mount talks about how things will be in future times, right? That the meek will inherit the earth and so on. The fact is that Jesus lived his life as if he were living the future times he spoke about. Meaning, he walked the walk, right? He talked about heaven and what it would be like, and at the same time, he tried to make his corner of the world a heaven. He helped people, he humbled himself, he gave of himself, he took only what he needed. He made loud cries for justice. He agitated and spoke out and offered people a vision of what was possible, not just in the future, but now. That was his ministry. And in anticipation of Easter, I often think about what would have happened if he had been allowed to live. Have you ever thought about this? Am I the only one who's ever speculated on this? I wonder, would people have become disillusioned with his message? Would he have just gotten exhausted and totally frustrated with everything? Would he have been able to make some of the radical changes he was calling for? Would he have been able, even more than he already did, to change the world? In my academic life, I spent a good deal of time studying the Franciscans and Dominicans, and one thing that always struck me and frustrated me is what happened to Francis and his sort of vision and his mission in his life. And not unlike Jesus, he made radical calls for a change in how religion was done, a change in how people viewed their own lives. But again, not unlike Jesus, his mission and his message became institutionalized, right? It had to. In a way, there's no choice. You can't really have a radical movement that lasts for 2,000 years. It's not radical anymore, probably after that long a time. And so the church, as it came to exist after Jesus' time, and the Franciscan movement, as it came to exist after Francis, both of those institutions amassed a great deal of wealth, right? Truly. If you think about how much wealth they had, the difference between the lifestyle of bishop-led and the lifestyle of serf-led, or the leader of the Franciscans, the minister general, and just a regular medieval peasant. Vast difference. And not only did they amass great wealth, they asked a lot of the people they were serving, right? They asked for a lot back. That notion of working as Jesus did to create justice, of exhorting people to respect each other and see each other as brothers and sisters, it kind of left the realm of the here and now in some ways. We are in a moment of great economic disparity. There are very few who hold vast amounts of wealth and a great many who hold very little. It's interesting to consider that in some ways that's always been true. If you looked on a global scale, America had a good deal of wealth, and still does, by contrast with other countries around the globe. But now the disparity is much more acute inside our own country, and there are signs only that it will get worse. And I by no means think that it's the only issue of our day. There are many, but it's one that we've actually never really spoken about here. I was realizing. We haven't really talked about income inequality here. And I thought it was interesting considering all of the things that this congregation does, right? We work with food banks to collect food. We cook meals once a month for people in Peekskill who are underserved. We collect blankets and clothes and make the midnight run down into the city to help homeless people. We help buy Christmas presents for families that might otherwise not be able to afford them. Right now we're in the middle of amassing school bags and school supplies for Syrian children. We do a lot that focuses on the symptoms of income inequality. And that's what I started to think about, the symptoms versus the cause. You know how this goes, right? You find yourself getting chronic headaches. You start taking Advil. But if you never get to the bottom of the chronic headache, you're going to be taking Advil every day for the rest of your life, right? You can't walk around with a headache, you won't function properly, you've got to treat it, but you've also got to go figure out why they're happening in the first place and put an end to that, right? It's the Band-Aid versus the cure, and it's vital, I have to say that, it is vital that we put on the Band-Aid. People are dying of hunger, of exposure, of a lack of medical care. The Band-Aid is important. I would never say that it is not. We have to keep collecting food and clothing and money to help. But aren't we also responsible for finding a cure? Isn't that what our theology teaches us? It's certainly what our president called us to do back over 2 years ago by saying, and he's right, that our country can be, should be, must be better than the poverty we're allowing to continue. It's certainly what Jesus calls us to do, if not by his words that promise future restitution, then by his actions that call for earthly restitution. Our theology calls us to the creation of an earthly heaven, because this life may be all we have, and heaven is not made of Band-Aids. I really hope it's not made of Band-Aids. Just recently, our Social Action Committee changed its name to the Social Justice Committee, or team, committee, for exactly this reason though, right? It's a recognition that we have to act, we have to keep plugging the holes, right? Stop the bleeding, put the Band-Aid on, but that we have to do something more. We have to try to isolate the cure and fix the systemic problem. If we're stopping with action, we're stopping with short term, right? And we're called to find long-term solutions. We're called to aspire to justice. Not just fairness or equality, justice. And justice isn't about fixing for the moment. It's about creating and insisting on and sustaining just systems. When FDR called for freedom from want, I don't think he meant a cycle by which people experience chronic want, are generously gifted with something, and then go right back to experiencing want. I think he was calling for a radical change in our understanding of what each person deserves in life, right? The opportunity, the possibility, the social safety nets, the caretaking of each other that we must do for each other. But what does all of that mean, right? What does it look like to find a cure for the root cause? And what can we do beyond the Band-Aids we already do? And I'm going to say it again, the Band-Aids matter. Please don't stop doing the Band-Aids. The Band-Aids are really important. People do experience want, and those of us who have the ability to share must share to alleviate that pain. And second, I'll be honest, I actually don't know what the solution is. This is one of those sermons. I'm sorry, I apologize. It's one of those sermons where I tell you there's a really big problem and I don't know how to solve it, and we're gonna have to figure it out together. Because what I'm talking about isn't everyone with money needs to give it all away and live like a pauper. That doesn't change the system, right? We still have the same system. And I'm not saying that we should institute communism, okay, don't worry. But I am saying that there is a deep and abiding problem in our country. It's been going on for decades and it is only growing, and it is one that, to paraphrase President Obama, is anathema to the foundational beliefs and commitments of our nation. The idea that the CEO is making 273 times the average worker. It's such an unbelievably skewed set of values. There isn't a simple fix to a problem that runs that deep. Because it's a problem of values, of habit, of structure, of ancient and sustained privilege. And I'm not trying to shame anyone who sits on the side of the wealthy. Please don't misunderstand. What I want is for all of us, wherever we sit in this spectrum, to consider how we, all of us, might be part of a solution to the question of this shamefully wide gap in our country's wealth. Because it is part of who we are to believe in the American dream of upward mobility. It's part of America's history to offer a chance for betterment, the chance for change and a new life. You could argue that's what every single one of our ancestors that wasn't native to this land did, set out to find a better life for themselves and their children. When America has ceased to be a place of common prosperity and possibility, what has it become instead? When the salt of the earth loses its saltiness, what is it? And should we be okay with that loss? I don't think so. Times change, nations and cultures evolve, but for centuries we have tried to stay true to a promise of opportunity. And there's value in staying true to a promise. Something is broken, and it needs fixing on the surface, and it needs fixing at its most basic level. How will you be part of the cure?